Welcome to Gradient Proof, a long-form discussion on a range of topics from AI to philosophy to entrepreneurship. We start each podcast sober and let the proof gradient the course of discussion. As always, we encourage you to drink with us. Welcome to The Gradient. Welcome to the Gradient Proof podcast. Today we'll be discussing a book Stephen and I have read and about the case against education. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and the author, Stephen? And we can
Sure.
jump into our take on education, where it's going today with today's technology, and where we see the relevance of the book and those ideas in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to repeat, the book in question is The Case Against Education, Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. And this came out of January 2018 by Bryan Caplan, who at the time was an economic professor at the University of Princeton. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the central problems he kind of explores within this book is particularly in terms of primary, tertiary, and tertiary and or university education, is what in fact is being accomplished kind of at a societal level. Meaning, are you learning skills that are going to be helpful, right, in your future job, kind of the human capital analysis approach to the value of the education? Or are you, in fact, buying into a system that shows conformity and the ability to kind of signal a stick-to-itiveness, right, through both a pre-university and university type process, wherein the education itself is acting as a signaling activity for employers interested in hiring workers, but this is divorced from an overall analysis of what skills they may or may not have, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what we're discussing today, particularly topically, the costs of education, student loans related to education, and really this perennial question of what value does some of both the courses and what you learn in the classroom have for later life.
Absolutely. So, quick question. I mean, have you taken a look at all at how education, I guess, initially started, or at least modern education with the college system today, and that essentially being the status quo, I think, by many?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when we talk about the modern university system, I think for the purposes of this argument, we could probably look at the GI Bill following World War II, right, in which you went from a statistical smaller amount of Americans that went to the university. I think the number at max was something like maybe 17% of Americans had some university level education, right? To, if not within that particular GI generation itself, certainly with their children, the expectation of moving from both a high school to a university diploma type track, right, had become a little bit more pronounced. So that's kind of where I would look at this here. Not to argue, of course, that the American universities started in the late 40s or the 50s, right? But I think then you saw the university experience become more of a mainstream, or at least mainstream within the discourse of American life.
Absolutely. And the thought that comes to mind is the education system of, let's say, the 50s potentially could not work today, right? Because the society itself has changed, moving more from maybe manufacturing and agricultural into more of one that's based in technology. And if you were to plan out how an education system could then lend itself to the country and how that would assist with the country's greater visions and goals, I guess it would have to be something that's very adaptive. And it seems to me that maybe the high school that I went to isn't or hasn't tweaked very much today in this some 15 years since then. So what's interesting is what the process is internally for how the system itself changes, right? You would have other systems that are typically adaptive, or there's an adaptive program in there that's reflective of the changes in the job market, things of that nature. And I just wonder what those are. It seems like today the climate is very supported, right? You've got universities like Harvard, Princeton, who have endowments of billions and billions of dollars that still charge tuition, probably still have books, and are also supported by student loans that are backed by the U.S. government. So I guess one question is, do you think there's even a need for these organizations to change? And I'm kind of hinting at where the book referenced that going to a university is maybe more of a marker or a classification that talks about your conformity level other than your actual intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Now that's a good question. I mean, first of all, to think about the need for the university system to change, I guess we could argue that at least from the larger schools mentioned, Harvard in particular, with the endowment as a marketable product, there is no need for a Harvard to change, for example, meaning that the service that it is offering is in no way kind of challenged in terms of a present supply and demand curve, right? And that may or may not be a bad thing. The question becomes ultimately, and I think too, he kind of brings this up in the book, is when we think about skills that one potentially could learn within the classroom, is the classroom itself the best environment to learn how to work, right, if you will, right, and have those skills that perhaps are valuable to an employer. And it is another argument, which is, at least initially, can we think about the idea that if one truly wants to learn how to work, the best way to do that is simply to learn said skills on the job, right, as opposed to within the classroom. However, right, and I think this is kind of what he explores at length, when you really step back, right, the virtue of, let's say, finishing high school and going straight into the workforce, or finishing high school and starting your own business, or going to the university and dropping out and you again starting your own business, at least at an anecdotal level, doesn't seem to be kind of appreciated by employers, by society, right, over having gone this other route, right, of having put your 3-4 years in for a diploma, even though you could argue that the high school student that worked 3-4 years instead of being in a classroom, right, should be more highly valued, right, than the person that is essentially new to work, right? But in fact, we see the opposite, right? The person that's going to be offered more money is the person that went the classroom route, as opposed to working 40, 50 hours a week.
Instead of going to school? Or
instead of going to school. And he kind of brings up studies to this effect where, and this is kind of like the lifelong earnings argument, is about the completion of a bachelor's degree, right, is going to produce lifelong earnings, at X over simply the completion of a high school degree.
Right. And I think to that too, I'm sure there's nuance in the specifics of the major, right? I think one thing that, at least from my experience, there's no kind of moment when you were choosing a major or direction in life that people kind of showed you where you would actually end up, right? Where does the road of the next, 4, 5, 6 years from high school to the end of graduation, where does that actually take you, right? Where do you end up? So if you want to be, let's say, a librarian, but you want to live in a certain city, there may be some conflicts there as far as how you'll be able to do something at a lower paying job versus a higher paying environment or a capital requirement. And I think that's, some people might say, oh, well, you should follow your passion, or you should do, something that you actually enjoy doing, so work doesn't feel like work, right? And I think that's certainly an argument, but there's a reality of the system that we're a part of today, and the zeitgeist of today. So it's almost like, if you had a BA in, let's say, a lower paying job versus working as a plumber and starting a plumbing business and having multiple trucks and employees. I mean, who is better off on a financial level, right? And let's even go past that from a happiness level, right? So because if how many hours are there in a week, right? I mean, you're looking at essentially a third of it is for work. You have two other thirds that you're probably sleeping for half of that, and the other third you're essentially either preparing for work or doing things in your leisurely time during the work week, right? So, what maybe it's more of a personal thing. If you could only choose one or the other, but I guess what kid grows up and wants to be like, let's say, an accountant for waste management, right? It's like, if you ask a child, they'll typically respond with things that they've been exposed to, right? But it's hard to actually make that commitment as you become exposed to different types of things. And who knows, maybe you may find there's some exciting avenues that haven't been explored in the accounting of waste systems and those financial ways of diverting things. So I guess one thing that's interesting is like a lot of the times you'll see innovations where you have someone who's been in two different fields that are then combining some of the concepts of the other ones, right? But I guess if you were to create the simplest system that then could create a outcome for most individuals, do we end up where we are right now, where you have free choice of what you want to do, which let's say for instance you had a whole class of people that were presented with the more higher output, higher paying jobs. Would you have a disproportionate amount of people that only do that, and then society loses its some of the lower end type of or lower paying type of work because people then divert in that way, right? And is it the parents that then drive people? Like you'll hear typically, immigrants will want their kids to be doctors or lawyers, and are kind of pushed more into those safer, higher paying careers, but are also, doctors, essentially help society. Lawyers, there's some disagreements depending on what side you're on, but
Sure. No, good questions. Good questions. I think coming back, another thing that was kind of highlighted to the fact of when we think about the evolution of education, we also think about, at one time, this idea and kind of exploring it statistically, a high school degree was quote unquote enough, right? You could graduate for high school and you had everything, both from a skills and a signaling perspective that you kind of needed for, a virtuous and participatory life in the world around you. And again, there were a statistical few that had further advanced degrees, right? And they were the bachelors in particular, and they were rewarded, right, for that, right, more than perhaps just having a high school degree. But one of the things he highlights is while not just, for example, in America, but particularly in the greater world, as the bar has been raised, right, to the bachelor's degree, right, or the equivalent being the new minimum threshold, right? What that has done is it's actually moved from that high school diploma to bachelor degree dynamic to the bachelor degree to some form of graduate education dynamic, right? In that ability to kind of signal or stand out has shifted, right? The question becomes, though, from the efficiency of additional time in the classroom, right, is on two levels. Does having spent 4 additional years after high school to potentially 6 additional years after high school on average for a graduate degree, right, make you better equipped for work, right, and or when you look at all those additional years, again, being particularly expensive years, from an ROI perspective,
Hmm.
right? What is the return on the graduate credential, right?
Hmm.
And you mentioned lawyer and doctor, which again is a graduate credential with
Hmm.
a law degree or medical degree. But his argument is, in fact, that when you look at it statistically, there is, although there are many jobs that require a graduate degree, right? There is a diminishing return in terms of pay scale, right? And furthermore, when you get deep into those jobs itself, right, it is arguable that in fact this type of job is using a skill set, right, that required 6 years of additional education, right?
Hmm.
It's simply a gating phenomenon. You have to have a graduate degree for this job, but when you really look at what the person is doing in said job, pessimistically, sometimes they're not doing much more than they could have easily handled with high school diploma and
Hmm.
maybe 6 or 9 months experience under their belt, right? When it
Hmm.
really comes down to that, and
Right.
that's one of the things he kind of explores.
Yeah, but what about like to challenge that?
Yeah.
So, if there's certain like with experience, you run into abnormal kind of conditions, and you learn how to um, kind of figure that out. But I guess the one thing in the argument for the longer education period for doctors, you would learn more of the basics and the fundamentals
Hmm.
of why things are happening, right? And then it's almost in at least for that, it makes sense to have both, right? Because you understand the fundamentals. If something does go wrong, and you have that embedded in your mind of why that what is could be potentially causing it, and it's been really embedded, then you can make quicker decisions. Um,
Hmm.
you know, so I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I also wonder when doctors go to school, do they know what field they're getting into initially, or is there more generalization up front, and then after that they can kind of hone in?
That's a good question. I don't know in the particular training process of a doctor. I think the initial part of medical school is kind of more generalist and then becomes a little more refined over time.
Mm-hmm.
But doctors could speak better that. But I think
Right.
that actually speaks to the other question in terms of the general core, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when one goes to university, regardless of major interest or final outcome, there's usually some sort of a language requirement,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or there are these other core classes that may or may not philosophy, history, et cetera. Not to say that there's anything wrong with these as pursuits, but I think he's speaking from as an economist. He actually says that when you kind of look at what are his students truly learning, right,
Mm-hmm.
in his class on economics, his argument is probably how to be an economics student and to teach economics,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Many of the courses within his particular discipline don't really have kind of a real world logical
Mm-hmm.
application, right? Other than going on to become an economics professor, right?
Right.
And he spends a lot of time kind of reflecting back on this again and again because sometimes when we think about the spectrum of university education where the art history major is over here, right,
Mm-hmm.
and things like economics, maybe even uh, uh, economics, accounting, and other topics. So there usually is kind of like a rank order, right, in the mind of what has greater outside university utility than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he actually kind of drills down on this and he says, well, some of the initial assumptions of I think he even looks at computer science at some
Mm-hmm.
point. The initial assumption is that these majors are better calibrated to teaching those skills that are going to be used in the outside world. And in fact, the actual both the transference in terms of the education process itself and the
Mm-hmm.
ability for said students to actually apply what they're learning in the classroom in all general cases, right, is actually quite disappointingly minimal, right, is what he kind of comes up with.
Well, if you think about how school's typically structured, it's almost a single person's game, right? You're typically, you take tests by yourself. There's not as much collaboration. When you do try to collaborate, it could be considered cheating, right? If you're to do homework with somebody else. There are obviously some schools, like I believe like the Montessori schools and stuff like that, where grades aren't really a thing. It's more so like an exploration, right? Getting a D in first grade and then an A later in later grades, may affect you on a historical card, but it could also indicate like improvement or a better understanding of the system, right? It could, in the same vein, say that you are good within the system, but this is the education system, and you're good to conform to that, right? You get better at testing by yourself and not working with others and things like that. But then when you get placed in the real world, you're put on teams, and it just becomes a different dynamic depending on where you are. The interesting thing here is, like, let's say there was an ability to create kind of this one philosophy and way to educate to get the best outcome, whatever that outcome is. You also have the problem of you're then distributing that to thousands of schools in thousands of different cultures with thousands of different climates within the U.S. alone, right? So, I mean, there seems like there could be an opportunity where, and we've seen this kind of open up with, people being able to successfully work from home, is to potentially learn from one teacher or one, like you could almost have like a pre-recording of the best teacher teaching a certain subject. And I'm sure we've all encountered that. You have one teacher that teaches something that you may not even be interested in, but the way that it's portrayed and introduced to you makes it interesting, and potentially can change the course of your life, right? So if you had, let's say, you found out who the best teachers were to actually deliver, or what that meant to deliver something that was truly engaging, and you were able to do that where you could do it, let's say, online or whatever, and then locally, on a local level, you had somebody that would then be almost like an assistant, right? So you take a test or you do a workshop or something like that, and that happens on more of a local level. And I think the beauty of that, because right now you're really restrained to those individuals that are teaching, the time in which everyone can come and meet together within a reasonable time frame. But if you were to essentially say, these are the 15 classes you need to take, and you can take them online, it may take one person one semester to finish each class, let's say, and get to that final place. Or you may have someone who learns a lot quicker and is able to then pick up that information much more quickly, and then advance much more quickly, right?
Sure.
And I think what's interesting about that is you end up creating, I think there'd be a little bit of chaos initially, right? Because you may have like 10-year-olds who have essentially done all the work necessary to become a doctor, right? And maybe they don't have the maturity, and maybe there's, because they're, 10 years old, but, let's say there was a, minimum, or there's some kind of restriction there where you had to be 18 for you to then be able to do this job, right? Like you can't serve in our government unless you are past a certain age, right? You can't have a president that's 34 years old. You have to be 35 and older, right? So maybe it's the same thing there, where there's a little bit of fine tuning on when you're allowed to actually practice these things. But it seems like there's an opportunity, and I just wonder if, like, what is holding back the system from changing? And it might be that, in any structure, you can only have so many of certain pieces of the, like if you think of a company as a machine, right? You've got like the operator, right? You could say like the CEO and stuff like that. And there might be, and there's a system as it moves down, at least in companies that are structured well. But there's a certain balance that needs to be achieved, right? So if everyone becomes superhuman, you might say, or like with their intelligence, because they're able to learn more, the system works better in your favor, you might say that may throw off the machine, right? And I think that is probably an argument that makes a lot of sense. I think where it becomes an imperative to create a system that everyone does become much smarter, and there are less people who work on kind of the lower level types of jobs that are needed. I think that comes into play with AI and the potential of society really changing, where a lot of the lower level work that might have been required can no longer be done efficiently with humans, right? Which you could say is a good thing, because then you're taking people like the next Picasso or Rembrandt or whoever who could have been doing a more creative thing, which we're probably better suited for, other than doing something mundane or repetitive like low-level manufacturing or
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. A couple of things with that, and particularly talking about AI in education, which, again, everything AI is something that really excites us here, right? Kind of building. So, Brian in his book doesn't really talk about AI as much, but he spends a lot of time talking about both transference, the ability to move knowledge from one person to the other, right? And also fade out, right? And he looks at fade out in the fact of both, during the summertime, what information is kind of lost at the primary level, but also at the university level as well, in which, disappointingly enough, both at the basis of, when that final semester ends, right? A lot of the knowledge and skills that, or the knowledge in particular that had been accrued, attested later, seem to be forgotten relatively quickly. The same is also true, unfortunately, with IQ, right? Where there's education that there's evidence that throughout one's career, right, that IQ does increase through education more generally. However, these increases, I think at one point he talks about the fictional book Flowers for Algernon, right, in which Algernon is able to achieve a superhuman type intelligence, but it almost fades quite as quickly, right? So the highest IQ a student will have will kind of be in the midst of that education, but 18 to maybe 24 months later is showing to statistically move away. Which kind of brings us again to this question of where AI could play a role, particularly machine learning, artificial intelligence, the ed tech space more generally, right? We have seen a quote unquote educational, well, edutainment software has really been around all of our life, right? Going back to even things like Oregon Trail or
Right.
different math and reading games available on the computer. We've seen a new availability of apps that, at their core, right, are or present themselves to be very, very much focused on efficient ways of instruction, and that instruction, right, can happen in some cases at the millisecond or hundredth of a second level, right, throughout the ages. One application that I very much enjoy is called Memrise, which is a group out of the UK. And what they've put together is this language learning platform, right, that is based on the memory theory that you learn something new, and then after a duration of time, you would reinforce that. But the way to really lock it in is to kind of wait for that moment when you're about to forget that thing and then reinforce it again. So the app is basically forever indexing, right? And any number of words, and I've played around with this in German, Spanish, Chinese, Italian, interlingua, etc.
Right.
And there is forever this kind of database out in the cloud that is remembering to the hundredth of a second the last time I reviewed certain information, right? And I can't help but think that, like when I was in high school, for example, the utility of those language classes aside, right? How convenient this would have been, and how tailored this would have been, right? In terms of picking up that initial Spanish vocab, right?
Right.
And thereby that that classroom experience could shift from the rote memory vocab instruction, right,
Right.
to something that's much more organic and interactive, right? Because you would already show up knowing 500 words,
Right.
which should be fun.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, so like, let's think about what the what is the reason that you would forget things over time, right? If you're not using it for any purpose, you may forget something at some duration, as you mentioned, right? So it's interesting. It's almost like an artificial, which it's not like we haven't done other things artificially, right? To manipulate our brains and our bodies and things of that nature. But it's the same. How much of the non-essential classes you took in high school and college that maybe you don't remember, but maybe you really only remember one thing, which could lend itself in some kind of value down the road. Even as small as like telling a story at a company junction that then intrigues somebody who that then elevates you to a promotion or something like that, because
Sure.
you've got some other interest outside of whatever your main. Who knows? I mean, there's so many different ways to account for that information and how it can play out in the long term. But I guess one of the things is, there may be certain pieces of information that we don't need, and that's why we forget about them, right? So, like, let's say, for instance, you move to a foreign country where English or whatever your current language was not the spoken language. You would, likely out of necessity become very efficient at that language. But then if you were to leave for 10 years, you would not have that same efficiency, right? And maybe that in some ways is a good thing. And you're almost by changing your environment, you're almost telling your brain you no longer need that data. Which I guess if you could, being a person and being able to anticipate the next time of your return, you may beforehand recall some of those things to freshen up, right?
Sure. And how could maybe an AI system help with that, right? Kind of reloading. And there are, I mean, to go in a slightly different direction, I think there's a lot of possibilities and maybe maybe kind of really exciting possibilities. So, for example, if you went from country X and then you came back again, as you said, and then you were going back again, right? Okay. I think manually you could kind of run yourself through a situation of reviewing old photos or any old notes you could find, or maybe dusting off said language primer that you had initially, right? But what also might be interesting is if you could step into something far more interactive and organic, right? In terms of rebooting, right? I mean, one of the theories of learning here is the fact that it isn't necessarily clear to me that within the 10-year time frame that we describe, right, that in fact you may have forgotten anything, right? What may actually just be, or probably I would think is the case, is the fact that certain like neural frameworks within your head have simply even if not completely, not necessarily atrophied, or just not really as active as they once were, right? So you're not, quote unquote, necessarily firing on those cylinders either in a conscious or unconscious state or dream state or what have you. It's just somewhere else, right? And what would be kind of interesting is thinking about maybe kind of an AR, VR, AI, or even metaverse-like system, right? That would be looking at a holistic number of ways to kind of reboot, right? And it could be something as much as going out and pulling newspaper articles or news clips that you would have seen at the time you were living there, right? And maybe even have you interact with old subway maps as opposed to showing you the brand new subway map, right? Have you in fact walk through that process of this is the subway as you remember it, right? And then layer onto that, right? The literal additional stops, right? Kind of making that transition from the one place to the other, right?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's also I was thinking like without any technology. I mean, one way you could reboot the language is almost just keeping in touch with a friend that's from there, right? And then that allows you to kind of still keep that a little fresher. But if you were to almost prepare yourself before you were to arrive, or you could do it through maybe some kind of digital experience. So I mean, it's interesting. This kind of maybe plays its way into education and how you continually stay up to date on certain topics, right? Where it's like in high school, you may have a music class that you only use to satisfy an elective, right? But then you never revisit that because maybe, well, I guess you don't need to. But then if you have one in college, maybe later, so first one in high school, second one in college, you still may have some remnants of those concepts. And maybe those concepts can then find its way kind of into a new invention in your own field, right? I think there's two inventors of the television, but one was a younger boy who essentially got the idea of creating lines of pixels because he worked on a cornfield. So you have those concepts and that like cross pollination and really inspiration of taking different concepts from different areas. So I mean, I guess one thing as a greater question is, there's typically a major, right? That's that, and literally in itself, that is a major focus, right? But what if you had 4 majors or 5, and it didn't take you 4 or 5 times the time to actually do that? It was more so you were able to acquire that information much more quickly because there's better ways of getting that information. So I think that's kind of a missed opportunity. I do think that, like I was saying earlier, I mean, the more you think of it, is there's this constant fear of AI that it will eventually remove the ability for people to make a living, which is obviously terrifying, at different scales, more terrifying at larger scales. So I think in order to get ahead of that, you've almost got to educate your society now to then match the future progression of these things. So if you have,
which ironically may involve AI.
Right. Itself, yeah.
Right. In ed tech in particular.
Right.
But, yeah.
And, there's an interesting part of it because, when you go to school, everyone gets their grades. Some teachers will reveal the grades of the class. Sometimes it'll just be a personal thing of one person. But I think we've seen the benefits of gamification and things like that. So it's one thing if you're in your school, let's say you're a competitive person, but you're only aware of your classroom's grades, you may excel to only a limit of being the best in that class. But if you were to create essentially a competition, a friendly competition of who is the most advanced third grader in history or whatever, and there was gamification ways to actually reference other people, I think you'd have a lot more progression a lot more quickly.
Sure.
It bases it in some kind of ledger of some sort.
Sure.
And I think then you would have this people who become super learners. They become more curious.
Yep.
But then also within reference to the rest of the people they live with, right?
Yeah. And I do agree, and it's been pretty well proven that gamification, which again is making kind of a soft competitive activity, encouraging everything from a weight loss app to a running app to kind of a dashboard within one's company of which sales team has done the greatest number of outreach emails this week, right? It's proven to become, it's proven to be quite useful as a motivator, including in contexts where the idea of gamifying something wouldn't have intuitively seem most likely. And it's also kind of interesting when we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular. I can't help but think that learning as quote-unquote reinforcement learning within this paradigm becomes where you yourself are becoming a better optimized or educated component that is in itself a symbiotic extension of the machine, right? So, for example, when I come back to this idea of the Memorize app, right? Okay. What it is looking to do is kind of reinforce or we can almost adopt the language of the software programmer, troubleshoot, right? Those circumstances in which different matching activities aren't occurring correctly, right? Meaning the association of one thing with another thing. In this case, the example is language, right? And it will kind of almost in a machine-like or repetitive type function, right? Kind of drill or reinforce that again and again and again, right? that is, going back to the classroom is kind of almost non-human, or the way we would think about non-human in the same way that we talk about rote education. That is kind of like going.
Wait, there's more. To listen to the next part of this episode, please follow the platform catalog.